This is a work of cinematic fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional. Brandon Whitmore didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He stood in the middle of the living room Amara had spent 4 months designing, the one where she'd hand-selected every tile, every light fixture, every piece of furniture, and he pointed at the front door like she was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. "This house is mine," he said. "Pack what you need and be gone before sunset. I don't want a scene." Behind him, a woman in a silk blouse sat on Amara's couch, legs crossed, not even bothering to pretend she wasn't comfortable there. Amara looked at her husband of 15 years. She looked at the woman. She looked at the room she had built with her own hands, her own eye, her own money. And she said very quietly, "Are you sure about that, Brandon?" He laughed. He actually laughed. He had no idea that the answer to that question would cost him everything. If this story already has your attention, stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. And if you're watching this right now, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, because the stories only get more intense from here. The morning it all fell apart started like any other Tuesday. Amara Ellington Whitmore. She had kept her maiden name hyphenated, a decision Brandon had always quietly resented. Woke up at 5:45 because her body refused to sleep past 6, regardless of what day it was. She made coffee in the kitchen she'd had renovated 2 years ago, the one with the cream-colored cabinets and the brass fixtures she'd sourced from a small manufacturer in Ohio after the big-box store versions looked cheap to her eye. She had a client meeting at 9, a follow-up call at 11, invoices to send before noon. She was a residential interior designer with a reputation that had taken her the better part of a decade to build. Not famous, not featured in glossy national magazines, but known, genuinely known, among the kind of people in their mid-sized Georgia city who had money and taste and needed someone who could translate one into the other. She had built that reputation from nothing, from a portfolio that started with her own apartment, from word-of-mouth referrals, from showing up on time and doing what she said she would do and caring about the work even when clients made it difficult to care. Brandon had never once attended a single one of her client dinners. He said it wasn't his world. She had attended 47 of his. She knew this because she kept a planner, a physical one, spiral-bound, the kind that people called old-fashioned, and she wrote everything down, every dinner, every corporate golf outing she'd smiled through, every holiday party where she'd worn the right dress and said the right things to the right people and helped Brandon look like a man who had it all together at home so he could project the same image at work. She was good at that, maintenance, the invisible architecture of a life. She sipped her coffee standing at the kitchen island and looked out the window at the backyard, at the garden she'd planted 3 summers ago, at the stone pathway that curved toward the back fence. She had laid some of those stones herself. Her back had hurt for a week afterward, and Brandon had told her she should have just hired someone. She had wanted to do it herself. She needed to. There were things about this house, their house, the house they'd bought together 12 years ago, when it was a dated, tired colonial with bad carpet and a kitchen that hadn't been touched since 1994, that she had poured her physical self into. Not just her design eye, her actual hands, her actual hours. There was a wall in the upstairs hallway that she had stripped and plastered and painted herself over 3 consecutive weekends because the contractor's quote came in too high, and she knew she could do it. Brandon had spent those weekends golfing. The house was worth considerably more now than what they had paid for it. That was not an accident. She noticed the changes in Brandon gradually, the way you notice a slow leak, not the moment it starts, but the moment you finally register that something has been wrong for a while and you just weren't willing to name it. It began, she thought, about 18 months ago, maybe longer. The late nights first. Not unusual for a man in commercial real estate, where deals moved on their own schedules and clients expected availability. But the quality of the late nights changed. He used to come home tired and talk about what he'd been doing. Then he came home and said very little. Then he started leaving the room to take calls. She had not confronted him immediately. This was something people criticized her for later, the ones who heard the story secondhand and applied their clean retrospective judgment to her messy lived experience. Why didn't you say something sooner? Why did you let it go on? Because she was not certain. Because she had been wrong before about smaller things and did not want to damage their marriage over a suspicion. Because she was also, if she was being honest, afraid of what he would say. Not afraid he'd deny it, afraid he'd confirm it, and she'd have to figure out what to do next, and that felt enormous. So she watched. She paid attention. She kept the house running and her business growing and her face composed, and she watched. The text message she wasn't supposed to see came on a Thursday evening in October. She had picked up his phone to check the time. Her own was charging in the other room, and the screen lit up with a preview from a contact saved only as S. Can't wait for Saturday. Wear that blue shirt. It does things to me. Amara had set the phone down carefully, the way you put something fragile on a shelf when your hands are shaking. She had not said anything that night either, but she started making calls the following morning. The first call was to her mother, Celestine Ellington, who was 71 years old and had worked as a paralegal for 30 years before her retirement, and who did not panic about anything. "I think Brandon is having an affair," Amara said. She was parked in a grocery store lot, unable to make herself go inside. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you suspected?" "Honestly, months, but I saw a text Thursday." "What kind of text?" Amara told her. Another silence. "Do you still have that prenup, baby?" "Yes." "Where is it?" "My file cabinet, the locked one." "Good." Her mother's voice was steady, the way it always was. Not cold, steady. There was a difference. "Don't move anything. Don't confront him yet. Call Malcolm." Malcolm Pierce was a family attorney. He had handled her parents' estate planning, her own business incorporation, various smaller legal matters over the years. He was 60-something, methodical, and deeply unimpressed by people who thought charm was a substitute for documentation. Amara called him from the same parking lot. "I need to talk to you about my prenuptial agreement," she said. "Come in Monday," he said. "Bring everything you have." She did not confront Brandon for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of watching him, of taking quiet photographs of texts she caught glimpses of noting dates and times in her spiral planner, of pulling together financial records and property documents, and the paperwork she had signed before their wedding that Brandon had treated as a formality. Brandon, for his part, was not careful. He had the confidence of a man who believed his wife wouldn't look too closely, and he had cultivated that belief over years of Amara being accommodating, being reasonable, being the one who smoothed things over and kept things running and did not make demands. He had mistaken her patience for passivity. He had mistaken her quiet for ignorance. These were the two most expensive mistakes of his life, though he wouldn't understand that for some time yet. The woman's name, she learned, was Sienna Brooks, 34 years old. She worked in marketing at a firm that had done work with Brandon's company. She was not a villain, exactly. Amara had thought about this carefully, in the clinical way she thought about most things when she was trying not to feel them. She was just a person who had gotten involved with a married man and apparently hadn't asked too many questions about what that married man actually had the right to offer her. She would understand the shape of that mistake eventually. The confrontation, when it came, was not planned. Amara had come home early on a Wednesday. Her 2 o'clock appointment had canceled, and she'd decided to work from home for the rest of the afternoon. She pulled into the driveway and noticed a car she didn't recognize parked along the side street, close enough to their property to be intentional about it. She sat in her car for a moment, then she got out and walked inside. Brandon was in the living room. He was not alone. Sienna Brooks was sitting on the sofa, Amara's sofa, the one she'd had reupholstered in a deep slate blue fabric that had taken her 2 weeks to find. And she stood up quickly when Amara walked in, the way a person does when they've been caught doing something they know they shouldn't be doing. Brandon did not stand up. He did not look away. He looked directly at her with an expression that she could only describe afterward as calculated, like he'd been waiting for this, like he'd been thinking about how he wanted this to go. "Amara," he said. His voice was level. "I've been meaning to talk to you." She looked at Sienna. She looked at her husband. She looked around the room she had designed, the room where she had planned dinners and hosted holidays and stayed up past midnight wrapping Christmas presents so the morning would feel magical for the two of them. And she felt something inside her go very still. "Is that right?" she said. "This isn't working." He gestured between them, vague and dismissive. "You know it hasn't been working for a long time." "Have I said that?" Amara said, "Have I said that to you, Brandon? Have I told you our marriage isn't working?" He shifted slightly. "It doesn't matter. It's been over. You know that." She looked at Sienna, who was staring at the floor and looked like she very much wanted to be elsewhere. Could you give us a few minutes? Amara said to her. Calm, not unkind, just firm. Sienna looked at Brandon. Brandon gave a small nod. Sienna walked quickly toward the front hallway and through the door, and then it was just the two of them in the room that Amara had built. How long? Amara asked. Brandon had the grace to look away for a moment. A while. How long is a while? Almost 2 years. She absorbed that. 2 years. The weight of it settled somewhere behind her sternum, heavy and cold. 2 years of dinners she'd cooked and trips they'd taken and conversations she'd worked to have. 2 years of her carrying the household, the social calendar, the emotional maintenance of their marriage, while he had been somewhere else entirely. I want a divorce, he said. He said it like he was completing a task. It's cleaner this way. No fighting, no dragging it out. You find a place, I'll keep the house. We divide the accounts and move on. You'll keep the house, she repeated. It makes sense. My name is on the mortgage. Your name is on the mortgage, she said slowly. Something about her tone made him pause. Yes. And you think that means you own it? I think it means I have the primary legal claim to Brandon. Her voice was still quiet, but something in it changed, just slightly, like a key turning in a lock. Do you remember what you signed before we got married? He blinked. The prenup. Of course. It was standard, Amara. It doesn't really... Did you read it? My attorney looked it over. Did you read it yourself? He was quiet. Did you read it, Brandon? I trusted my attorney to... Your attorney at the time was David Harmon, who was 28 years old and had been practicing for 3 years and was a friend of your college roommate, Amara said. My attorney was Malcolm Pierce, who had been handling property and family law for over 30 years, and the document he drafted was very specific. Brandon's face shifted. Not understanding, not yet, but some first flicker of uncertainty. What are you talking about? Amara picked up her bag from where she'd set it by the door. She pulled out a single business card and set it on the side table, the hand-painted ceramic table she'd found at an estate sale in Savannah, and refinished herself. That's Malcolm's number, she said. You might want to call him. She turned toward the hallway. Amara. Brandon's voice came out slightly differently now, the clean confidence in it faintly clouded. What does the prenup say? She turned back. She looked at her husband, the man she had loved, the man she had built a life alongside, the man who was standing in a room that would not belong to him for much longer. And she said, It says that this house belongs to the Ellington Family Trust. It says that my family's assets are protected in the event of infidelity. It says that the moment you brought another woman into this house, you lost any claim you thought you had. Brandon stared at her. It says, she continued, her voice still quiet, still even, that you signed away your rights to this property on page 7 of a document you held in your hands 15 years ago and never bothered to read. He said nothing. Pack what you need, she said. I'll be back Friday. She walked out through the front door and pulled it shut gently behind her. She sat in her car for a long time before she drove anywhere because her hands were shaking badly, and she needed them to stop before she trusted herself to drive. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something closer to grief. For the marriage she'd wanted, for the 15 years she'd poured into something that had been hollow in ways she hadn't wanted to see, for the version of Brandon she had believed in for longer than was probably reasonable. But beneath the grief, somewhere lower and steadier, there was something else, something that felt like solid ground. She had known this moment might come. She had prepared for it, not because she had planned to end her marriage, but because her mother and Malcolm had insisted years ago that love was not a substitute for documentation. She was grateful now that she had listened. She put the car in drive and pulled away from the house. She had calls to make. Malcolm Pierce's office smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting on a burner too long, and Amara had always found it oddly comforting. There was nothing performative about the space. No expensive art on the walls, no leather furniture chosen to impress. Just shelves of binders, a desk that had been in the same position for probably 20 years, and a man who had seen enough human foolishness that very little surprised him anymore. He was already at his desk when his assistant showed her in Thursday morning, and he looked up over his reading glasses with the particular expression he reserved for situations that were serious but not yet catastrophic, a kind of calm, careful attention that Amara had learned to read over the years. "Sit down," he said. Not unkindly, just direct. She sat. She had her bag on her lap, The big canvas tote she used for work that now also contained a folder of documents she'd spent Wednesday evening pulling together: bank statements, property tax records, a copy of the deed, and the prenuptial agreement itself, which she had retrieved from her locked file cabinet the same night she'd driven away from the house with her hands shaking. Malcolm reached across his desk, and she handed him the folder. He opened it without ceremony and began reading. She watched him read. He turned pages slowly, the way he did everything, without hurrying, without performing urgency he didn't feel. "He told you this house is his," Malcolm said. It wasn't a question. He said his name is on the mortgage, and that was his primary legal claim. Malcolm made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "His name is on the mortgage because we structured it that way. We needed him on the financing. That has nothing to do with ownership." He set down one page and picked up another. "The deed lists the Ellington Family Trust as the owner of record. Has since the purchase." He didn't know that. He signed documents that told him exactly that. Malcolm looked up. Whether he read them is a separate question. Amara pressed her fingers against the edge of her bag. "He says his attorney at the time reviewed everything." "David Harmon," Malcolm said, and his tone conveyed everything he thought about David Harmon without him having to say it directly. "Yes, I remember. Young man, very eager. He called me twice to ask questions he should have known the answers to." He set the folder down and folded his hands on top of it. "Amara, what Brandon's attorney told him or failed to tell him is Brandon's problem. The prenuptial agreement is valid, properly executed, and witnessed. The infidelity clause is explicit. He brought another woman into the marital home, which constitutes a breach under Section 4, Paragraph 2. He'll fight it." "He can try." Malcolm's voice was level. "He won't win, but he'll probably try." She exhaled slowly. "What do I need to do?" "First, don't move out of that house. You have every right to be there. If he's already there, and I assume he is, don't engage with him about property or legal matters directly. Anything he wants to say about the house, he can say to me." "He's going to be angry." "Yes, he probably will." Malcolm picked up a pen, clicked it once. People who don't read documents before they sign them tend to be very angry when those documents turn out to matter. That anger is not your legal problem. He paused. "It may be your personal problem for a while, but not your legal one." She nodded. Her throat felt tight. "Malcolm, what is the realistic timeline here?" "Depends on how cooperative he is. If he accepts what the documents say, we could resolve the property question in a matter of weeks. The divorce itself will take longer. There are financial accounts. There's the question of the business assets. My business. Your business is incorporated separately and predates the marriage as a formal entity, though you grew it significantly during the marriage. That will require some careful documentation." He made a note. "I want to see your business incorporation papers, 5 years of tax returns, and any contracts that show your individual client relationships." "I have all of that." "Of course you do." He said it without irony. He had known her long enough to understand that Amara Ellington was the kind of person who kept records. "What about shared accounts?" She pulled a second, smaller folder from her bag and slid it across the desk. He opened it, looked at the top sheet, looked up at her. "You pulled these last night?" "Wednesday evening." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "You've been preparing for this for a while." She didn't answer immediately. Outside the window, a bus went by on the street below, its brakes letting out a long, tired exhale. "I didn't want to need any of this," she said finally. "But yes." Malcolm nodded slowly. He didn't offer her empty reassurance. He just closed the folder and set it neatly on top of the first one, and said, "Then let's get to work." She returned to the house that afternoon. Brandon's car was in the driveway. She'd half hoped it wouldn't be, that he might have gone to stay with Sienna, or a friend, anyone other than her. But he was there. She could hear him on the phone when she came through the front door, his voice carrying from the direction of his home office at the end of the hall. She set her bag down in the kitchen. She put a pot of water on to boil, not because she was particularly hungry, but because she needed something to do with her hands. She stood at the stove and listened to the sounds of the house. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the hallway clock, the low murmur of Brandon's voice behind a closed door. And she tried to remember the last time she had felt fully at ease inside these walls. She couldn't pinpoint it. That was its own kind of answer. Brandon came out of his office 20 minutes later and stopped when he saw her. He looked tired, not remorseful. She knew what remorse looked like on his face, had seen it over smaller things across 15 years. Just tired and slightly cornered. "You came back," he said. "This is my home, Brandon." "I thought, I know what you thought." She turned back to the stove. The water was starting to move. "I spoke to Malcolm today." He came further into the kitchen. She heard him pull out one of the bar stools at the island and sit down, which was something. He was making a choice to stay in the room rather than retreat. She didn't know if that meant anything or not. "Amara, look." His voice had a different quality than it had yesterday, less clean, less certain. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the prenup." "Good. I called David Harmon." She kept her eyes on the pot. "Did you?" He said. Brandon stopped, started again. "He said he advised me to read the full document before signing, that he'd flagged some of the provisions." "I know. I have a copy of the letter he sent you." Silence. "He sent you a letter?" Brandon's voice was careful now, careful in a way it hadn't been yesterday. "He sent you a letter," she said, summarizing the key provisions. "Malcolm kept a copy in our file." She finally turned around to look at him. He was sitting with his elbows on the island counter, and for just a moment he looked less like the man who had pointed at the front door and told her to be gone by sunset, and more like someone who was starting to understand the size of what he'd walked into. "I'm not trying to make this ugly, Brandon. I want you to understand what the situation actually is, because you clearly didn't understand it yesterday. The house is not yours. It has never been yours. You have been living in a property that belongs to the Ellington Family Trust for 12 years, and you have never had a legal ownership interest in it." She said it without heat, just fact. "The mortgage, yes, your name is on the mortgage, which means you've been making payments on a property you don't own. That's actually a problem we structured very carefully to ensure you would have financial stake and credit benefit without having ownership claim." He stared at her. It sounds like exactly what it is. A legal structure that my family's attorney designed before our wedding to protect family assets. You were told about it. You signed the agreement. Whether you understood what you signed is a question you need to take up with David Harmon, but it doesn't change what the documents say. Brandon was quiet for a long time. The water behind her reached a rolling boil, and she turned the burner down. Outside, the evening light had gone that particular shade of late afternoon gold that she had always loved about this kitchen. The way it came through the window above the sink and made the whole room feel warmer than it was. "What do you want?" he said finally. Not combative. Almost, and this surprised her, genuine. "I want a fair divorce settlement. I want the house recognized as trust property, which it is. I want my business assets protected, which they should be. I want this handled by our attorneys so you and I don't have to fight about it." She paused. "That's actually all I want, Brandon. I don't want to destroy you." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You could." "I know." Another silence. There was something strange about it, a heaviness between them that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, some third thing that didn't have a clean name. "Is she still?" Amara started, then stopped. "Sienna." He said the name like he was testing how it sounded out loud in this kitchen. "I don't know. She left yesterday after you. After everything. She hasn't called." Amara nodded. She turned back to the stove and turned the burner off entirely. She wasn't actually going to cook. She just needed somewhere to put her attention. "I'm going to stay in the guest room until the attorneys work out the details," Brandon said behind her. Not a request exactly, more like a statement he was testing to see if she'd fight it. She thought about Malcolm telling her not to move out. She thought about the size of the house and the fact that 15 years of a shared life didn't evaporate because one conversation had happened in a living room. "Fine," she said, "but you leave my office alone, and you don't bring her here." "I wasn't planning to." "I mean it, Brandon." "I know." A pause. "I know you do." The next 2 weeks were the strangest of Amara's adult life. They lived in the house together like two people who were both waiting for something to happen, moving around each other in the kitchen, trading minimal sentences about practical matters, coexisting in a space that suddenly felt too loaded to be comfortable. It reminded her of the weeks after her father had died, when the family house had been full of relatives and grief and logistics, and everyone had been painfully polite because anger felt inappropriate and sadness felt too large to handle in the open. Brandon was quieter than she'd expected. She had braced herself for arguments, for manipulation, for the particular charm offensive he was capable of when he wanted something. The version of himself he deployed at work events, all warmth and humor and carefully deployed attention. Instead, he was just subdued. He left early in the mornings. He came home and made himself dinner and ate it alone in his office. He didn't ask her about her day, and she didn't ask about his, and they navigated around each other with a kind of brittle, exhausted care that might have looked like civility from the outside. She knew he'd called a different attorney. Malcolm had mentioned it without drama, someone named Greg Falk, who had a reputation for being aggressive in divorce cases. She steeled herself, but the aggression didn't come the way she'd expected. Greg Falk's first letter to Malcolm was measured, even somewhat conciliatory in its language, acknowledging the prenuptial agreement's validity while requesting time to review the trust documentation and explore whether the infidelity clause met the legal standard for enforcement. It was the letter of an attorney who had read the documents and was trying to find the least embarrassing exit for his client. "He knows," Malcolm told her on the phone. "Falk is smart. He's already seen this as a losing position on the property. He's going to try to get the best possible settlement on everything else." "What does that mean for us?" "It means we negotiate, which is actually better than litigation." A pause. "It may take some time." "I can wait," she said. And she meant it, not as a performance of patience, but as a simple statement of fact. She had waited before. She knew how to do it. It was during this strange, suspended period that Amara started doing something she hadn't done in years. She began walking through the house at night, not aimlessly, but deliberately, the way she did when she was scoping a new project. She moved from room to room with her phone, taking notes, looking at the space as she hadn't let herself look at it in a long time, through the eyes of her professional self rather than her domestic one. She noticed things she'd stopped seeing, the way the light hit the upstairs landing at 7 in the evening and turned the cream walls almost amber. The underused square footage above the garage that had always been listed as storage and had never been anything else. The flow of the ground floor, how the dining room and the study and the back sitting room connected in a way that would work beautifully for a different kind of purpose than a private home. She wasn't sure what she was thinking yet. She kept the notes to herself. But the house, which had started to feel like a wound, was beginning to feel like something else. A possibility. A problem she might actually enjoy solving. She didn't share this with anyone except her mother during one of their long Thursday evening phone calls, the habit they'd maintained for so many years that it felt strange if a Thursday passed without it. "You sound like yourself," her mother said. "I don't know what I sound like," Amara said. She was sitting in the sunroom off the back of the house, the one she'd added onto the original structure during the renovation. The windows looked out onto the garden in the dark. She could see the stone path faintly in the light from the kitchen. "You sound like you used to sound when you were working on a project you liked," her mother said. "That particular quality in your voice, like you're turning something over." Amara leaned her head back against the chair. "I'm thinking about what to do with the house. After the divorce. After all of it settles. When it's mine. Just mine. Officially." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking?" "I don't know yet. Something different. Something that isn't what it's been." "That's not a bad place to start," her mother said, "not knowing yet." The call that changed the atmosphere of the house came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks into their strange cohabitation. Amara heard it from the kitchen, Brandon's voice rising in his office, which almost never happened. He was a controlled man in his professional communications, careful and measured. But whatever was being said to him in that call was cutting through the control, and she heard him say, "That's not what I told you," and then something that sounded like, "I can't believe she would," and then nothing, because he'd apparently realized the volume and lowered it. She didn't ask about it that night. He appeared the next morning at the kitchen table earlier than usual, when she was still on her first cup of coffee and hadn't prepared herself for a conversation. He looked like he hadn't slept well. There were marks of it around his eyes. "There's a problem at work," he said. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was unusual enough that she set her cup down. "What kind of problem?" "Someone told the partners about the divorce." He was staring at the table. "And about the circumstances." Amara felt a complicated knot of emotion she didn't immediately want to examine. "Who told them?" "I don't know. Maybe no one told them specifically. Maybe they just heard things. Sienna's company works with ours. People talk." She kept her expression neutral. "What are the partners saying?" "Nothing yet. Officially." He ran a hand through his hair, which was already disheveled. But there's a board review of my division coming up, and the timing is. He stopped. It's bad timing. She thought about what to say. She thought about the way this news would have landed differently 6 months ago, how she would have immediately shifted into problem-solving mode, would have been thinking about who could be called, what could be done to protect his reputation, how to handle the optics. How much of their 15 years had been spent with her quietly managing the downstream effects of Brandon's choices while he remained the face of their life together. I can't help you with that, she said. He looked up. I'm not saying it to be cruel, she said. I genuinely can't. You need to handle that with your attorney and your partners. It's not something I have any role in anymore. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. Not anger, not blame. Something that might have been, in a different version of him, recognition. I know, he said. I know that. He pushed back from the table, stood up. He stopped, and she understood that whatever he'd been about to say wasn't going to come out as anything useful. He was standing in a kitchen she had renovated, at a table she had chosen, in a house he was going to have to leave, and he was starting to understand, not just legally, not just financially, but in some more fundamental way, what he had actually done and what it had actually cost. She watched him walk out of the kitchen. She picked up her coffee. She looked out the window at the garden, at the stone pathway that curved through the morning light. She thought about her mother's voice the night before. You sound like yourself. She thought about the notes on her phone, the measurements she'd been taking, the ideas that were starting to feel less like ideas and more like plans. She thought about the brass keys she'd taken from her desk drawer the day she walked out of this house for the first time. It was back in her desk now, in the locked drawer where she kept the things that mattered. She didn't know why she'd taken it that day. Instinct, maybe. Some part of her that understood that the most important things were the small ones, the ones that looked insignificant until they weren't. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup. She picked up her bag, her phone, her planner, and she went to work. She still had a business to run, clients who were counting on her, a life that had been running alongside this marriage the whole time and would keep running after it. The house would still be there when she got home. It had always been there. It had always been hers. Greg Falk requested a meeting in the 5th week. Not a deposition, not a formal hearing, just a meeting, the 4 of them in Malcolm's conference room, which Malcolm had agreed to with the kind of mild, unhurried courtesy that Amara suspected was specifically designed to put opposing counsel at a slight psychological disadvantage. His conference room was a good room for it, plain, slightly worn, with no intimidation built into the furniture or the art on the walls. Just a rectangular table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out over a parking structure. Nothing to perform against. Amara had dressed carefully that morning without letting herself think too hard about why. Dark slacks, a well-cut jacket in a shade of brown that her mother called cognac, low heels. Professional. Herself. Not trying to look like anything other than what she was. Brandon arrived 3 minutes after she did, with Greg Falk, who was a compact man in his early 50s with the kind of careful, watchful eyes that Amara associated with people who had spent decades reading situations for advantage. He shook Malcolm's hand, then hers, with brisk efficiency. Brandon shook Malcolm's hand and then looked at Amara in a way that was difficult to interpret. Not hostile, not apologetic, somewhere in the complicated middle ground they'd been navigating for 5 weeks. They sat down. Malcolm had water on the table. Nobody poured any. We appreciate you making the time, Falk began, and Malcolm made a small sound that acknowledged the courtesy without endorsing it, and then they got into it. Falk's position, laid out over the first 15 minutes, was essentially this. His client accepted the validity of the prenuptial agreement in its broad terms, including the trust structure governing the property. He was not contesting the house. What he was contesting was the scope of the infidelity clause as it applied to additional marital assets, specifically a joint investment account that had been funded in part by Brandon's salary over the course of the marriage, and the question of whether Amara's business growth during the marriage entitled her to an offset claim against Brandon's retirement accounts. It was, Amara thought, a careful retreat to a defensible position. He was giving up the thing he couldn't hold and fighting hard for the things he might. Malcolm's response was measured and specific, and she understood only about 2/3 of it in real time. She had learned years ago that the best thing she could do in legal discussions was to listen for tone and watch faces, rather than try to follow every technical point, and then debrief with Malcolm afterward when she had the space to absorb it properly. Brandon's face, across the table, was doing something complicated. He was looking at the documents Malcolm had spread across the table: the prenuptial agreement, the trust documentation, the property deed, and he was reading them with the kind of attention he clearly had not given them 15 years ago. She watched him scan lines of text and turn pages back and forth, and something in his expression had the quality of a man calculating a number he already knows is going to be bad. Falk and Malcolm went back and forth for another 20 minutes. Then Falk asked for a short break, and he and Brandon stepped out into the hallway. The room was quiet. Malcolm poured himself a glass of water and looked at Amara over the rim of it. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine," she said automatically. He gave her a look that communicated what he thought of that answer without him having to say anything. "I'm tired," she amended, "and I want this to be over, but I understand it won't be over today." "No," he agreed, "but this is a productive meeting. Falk is positioning for settlement. He wouldn't be in this room if Brandon intended to litigate." "What does settlement look like?" "Best case? He concedes the property entirely. We negotiate a fair division of the joint investment account, probably 60-40 in your favor given the infidelity clause, and his retirement account stays primarily his with a modest offset to yours for the business growth contribution." Malcolm set down his glass. "It's not a perfect outcome. It's a reasonable one." She nodded. "And worst case?" "He decides he has more pride than sense, and we spend 8 months in litigation before arriving at something close to the same outcome." A pause. "Brandon doesn't strike me as a man with that kind of endurance right now." She thought about Brandon's face across the table, the quality of his attention to those documents. "No," she said. "He doesn't." They came back in from the hallway. Falk sat down. Brandon sat down, and he looked at Amara directly for the first time during the meeting. Really looked at her, not the glancing sideways kind of eye contact they'd been managing in the house for 5 weeks. "I want to say something," Brandon said. Falk put a hand on the table, a gesture of mild warning. "Brandon, just one thing." His voice was level. Tired, but level. "Off the record, not for the documentation." Malcolm looked at Amara. She gave a small nod. "Okay," Malcolm said. "Go ahead." Brandon kept his eyes on Amara. "I didn't read it," he said. "The prenup. I know you asked me in the kitchen if I'd read it, and I didn't really answer you. The answer is no. David walked me through the highlights, and I signed it because I thought it was a formality, and because," he stopped, "because I was 29 years old, and I thought the paperwork was the boring part, and the marriage was the real thing." A pause. "I just wanted you to know that I'm not sitting here thinking you somehow tricked me. I understand what the documents say. I understand that I signed them." The room was quiet. Amara let the silence sit for a moment before she said anything. She had not expected this. She had prepared herself for Falk's legal maneuvering, for Brandon's resentment, for the particular cold transactional quality that divorce proceedings tended to develop. She had not prepared herself for honesty. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally, and she meant it, not as a tactical concession, but genuinely. Brandon nodded. He looked back down at the table. Falk cleared his throat. "If we can return to the investment account..." They returned to the investment account. The meeting lasted another hour and a half. Nothing was resolved, but the shape of a resolution became visible, the way on a cloudy day you can't see the sun but you know exactly where it is. They left without signing anything, but Malcolm was quiet in a way that meant he was satisfied, and that told Amara more than his words would have. In the elevator on the way down, she thought about what Brandon had said. "I was 29 years old, and I thought the paperwork was the boring part, and the marriage was the real thing." She understood that. She actually understood it. She had been 28 when they married, and she too had believed that love was the architecture and everything else was just detail. The difference was that her mother and Malcolm had insisted on the details anyway, had made her sit through the hours of legal explanation until she understood every page of what she was signing, and she had done it because she trusted them more than she trusted the idea that nothing would ever go wrong. She had not wanted to need those documents, but she had prepared for the possibility that she might. There was something in the difference between those two things that she was still working out, the difference between hope and preparation, the way you could hold both at once without one canceling the other out. It was the 6th week when Brandon told her he was moving out. She was in the sunroom when he found her, a Sunday morning, pale winter light coming through the windows. He stood in the doorway with the look of someone who had practiced what he was going to say and then lost the thread of it. "I found a place," he said. "An apartment. Short-term lease, near the office." She set down the book she hadn't really been reading. "Okay. I'll be out by next Saturday. Do you need help with anything? Logistics?" He blinked. She could see that the offer surprised him. "No, I've got it." "Okay," she said again. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. She could see him thinking about whether to say something else, weighing it. "The plant on the kitchen windowsill," he said finally. She almost laughed, not unkindly. "What about it?" "I've been watering it for the past 3 weeks. I didn't know if you'd noticed." She had noticed. She'd been watering it too, apparently in between his waterings, which probably explained why it looked slightly overwatered. "I noticed," she said. He nodded. Then he said very quietly, "I'm sorry, Amara. I know it doesn't undo anything, but I am." She looked at him standing in the doorway of the sunroom she had built off the back of the house she had spent 12 years making into something worth living in. She looked at the man she had been married to for 15 years, the one she had loved and chosen and organized her life alongside. And she thought about all the complicated things that were true simultaneously, that he had hurt her badly, that he was not entirely the person she had believed him to be, that he was also not entirely a villain, that grief and anger and something that might still be a thin thread of affection could all exist at once without canceling each other out. "I know you are," she said. He left the doorway. She heard him walk down the hall, heard the sound of his office door closing softly. She picked up her book. She looked at the page without reading it for a long time. The morning after Brandon moved out, the house felt enormous. She had expected relief, and there was some, a kind of lightening, the way a long-held breath finally releases. But there was also a size to the silence that she hadn't fully anticipated. The house was just rooms now, rooms she was in alone, and that was different from the house as the place where two people lived together, even two people who were in the process of legally dismantling their shared life. She moved through the room slowly that first morning, coffee in hand. She looked at the walls and the light and the proportions of each space. She had done this before, in the weeks of their cohabitation, the late-night walks with her phone and her notes. But now she did it with the full weight of the situation settled, with the understanding that the house was hers, had always been hers, and was going to stay that way. She thought about what her mother had said. Not knowing yet is not a bad place to start. She thought about the notes on her phone, the measurements, the underused space above the garage, the flow of the ground floor rooms. She called her business partner, Dina Cartwright, at 9:30 that morning. Dina was 54, black, originally from Memphis, and she had partnered with Amara in the design business for the past 6 years. She was also, in the way of people who have known you long enough, fully up to date on every development with Brandon and the house and Malcolm and the proceedings, because Amara had been unable to not tell her, and Dina had been unable to not ask. "He's out," Amara said when Dina picked up. "How are you?" "I don't fully know yet. Can you come over this week? I want to show you something." Dina came on Tuesday. Amara walked her through the house room by room, not talking about the marriage or the divorce, but talking about the space, the square footage, the flow, the natural light, the structural possibilities. She showed Dina the notes on her phone. She showed her the space above the garage. Dina stood in the center of the living room, the room where all of this had started, where Brandon had stood with Sienna on the sofa and pointed at the door, and turned slowly, looking at the ceiling height, the windows, the way the room opened into the dining area. "You're thinking about the studio," Dina said. "I'm thinking about expanding. This space would be—" Dina stopped, turned again. "Amara, this would be extraordinary." "I know. You've been sitting on this idea." "I've been living in the problem," Amara said. "Now I'm looking at it differently." Dina looked at her. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since about week 3. Dina laughed. A real laugh, warm and a little surprised. "You were still living with the man and you were already planning the renovation." "I was taking notes," Amara said. "I didn't know what they were for yet." The settlement agreement was signed on a Thursday afternoon in Malcolm's office, 7 weeks after the first meeting. It took 3 more drafts after the conference room meeting, and a particularly tense exchange between Malcolm and Falk, over the valuation of the investment account that lasted 2 days and required Amara to talk herself out of intervening directly on 4 separate occasions. Malcolm had told her to stay out of the back and forth, and she had stayed out of it, which was one of the harder things she had done in this process, because her instinct was always to engage problems directly rather than delegate them. But she had let Malcolm do his job. In the end, the property, confirmed as Ellington Family Trust, with Amara as sole occupant and beneficiary. The joint investment account, 62% to Amara, a modest offset from Brandon's retirement fund. Her business assets, untouched, protected by the incorporation structure Malcolm had helped her set up years ago. The mortgage transferred, Brandon removed, Amara assuming it entirely, which was manageable given what the investment settlement added to her financial picture. She signed her name 8 times. Her hand was steady. Brandon had signed at a separate session that morning. She didn't see him. Walking out of Malcolm's office into the gray Thursday afternoon, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the cold air hit her face and thought, this is what it feels like when a 15-year chapter ends. Not like a door slamming, more like a sound you've been hearing for so long you stop noticing it, suddenly going quiet. She took out her phone, called her mother. It's done, she said. Her mother exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. How are you? I think I'm going to be okay. I know you are. A pause. Come for dinner Sunday. I'll be there. She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk a moment longer, in the cold, in the quiet. Then she walked to her car and drove home. What she had not anticipated was how much the work would help. The design business had continued running through all of it. Clients didn't stop needing things because her personal life was in crisis, and she had not missed a deadline or a meeting or a delivery date in the entire 7 weeks. This was partly discipline and partly, she suspected, necessity. The work had been the thing that kept her from getting swallowed by everything she couldn't control. But now, with the settlement done, and the house hers, and the impossible suspended quality of those 7 weeks finally lifted, she let herself go fully into the idea she'd been holding at arm's length. She spent a week writing a proper proposal, not just notes on her phone, but an actual document, floor plans, cost projections, a timeline, a concept vision for what the space could become. She thought about the ground floor and how the living room, the dining area, and the study could be opened up into a single flowing studio space without touching the structural walls. She thought about the room above the garage, currently accessible only through a pull-down attic stair, and what it would take to make it a proper second-floor space. A design library, maybe, or a meeting room for client presentations. She thought about what she'd always wanted her business to be, underneath the practical shape it had taken, and whether the house was the place to make that happen. She had always wanted to mentor. She'd been doing it informally for years, taking on young designers as contract assistants, giving them more responsibility than the job description required, spending time on the phone with recent graduates who cold emailed her asking for advice. She had done this without a structure or a name for it, because there hadn't been space to do it differently. The house could be the structure. She didn't tell anyone the full shape of it yet. She talked to Dina about the studio expansion. She talked to her contractor, Raymond, about the structural questions. She talked to Malcolm about the trust documentation and what would need to happen to convert the property's use. She gathered information and ran numbers and revised her projections 3 times when they didn't add up the way she needed them to. She did not talk to Brandon. He had texted her once, 2 weeks after the settlement, a brief and somewhat formal message asking whether she had any preference about how to handle their remaining mutual friends' social events. Specifically, a mutual couple's anniversary party that they had both been invited to before everything fell apart. She had thought about this for a long time before texting back. She had written and deleted 4 responses. She finally sent, "Go, I'll decline. No need to make it complicated for them." He had replied, "Thank you." That was the last communication between them for several months. It was a night in late January, cold, with the particular kind of damp cold that the city got in winter that felt worse than the temperature suggested, when something happened that Amara had not seen coming. She was working late in what had been the study. She'd already started moving furniture in her head, testing configurations, thinking about how to use the room differently. Her laptop was open with the proposal on one screen and a floor plan on the other, and she had a cup of tea that had gone cold without her noticing. Her phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She had been getting occasional calls from numbers she didn't recognize ever since some version of her story had apparently circulated through their social network, People calling to express sympathy or outrage or curiosity, mostly well-intentioned, occasionally exhausting. She had started letting unknown numbers go to voicemail. But something made her answer this one. "Is this Amara Ellington?" A woman's voice. Young, or younger than Amara anyway. Careful. "It is. Who's calling?" A short silence. "My name is Sienna Brooks." Amara set down her tea. The silence stretched out. She wasn't sure what Sienna was expecting from her. Permission to speak, maybe, or anger, or the phone to go dead. Amara wasn't sure herself what she was going to do with this call. She hadn't thought about Sienna much since that day in the living room, not deliberately. When her mind had moved toward that image, the woman on her sofa, the silk blouse, the way she'd looked at the floor, she'd redirected it, not from generosity, but from self-preservation. There wasn't any productive place for that particular thread of feeling to go. "Why are you calling me?" Amara said. Her voice came out even. A little flat, maybe, but even. Another pause. "I don't entirely know. That's an honest answer. I've been going back and forth on whether to call for weeks." A breath. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I know that doesn't matter. I know it's not an excuse. But I want you to know that I didn't. He told me things. About your marriage, about you. I believed him." Amara was quiet. "He said you two had been done for over a year," Sienna continued. "He said it was already a legal formality. He said—" She stopped. "He said a lot of things that turned out not to be true." "They usually do," Amara said. "Not with heat, just as fact." Another silence. "I'm not calling to ask you to understand, or to forgive me. I know I don't have the right to ask for either of those things." A slight catch in her voice. "I just wanted to say it to you directly, because I think you deserve to hear it directly." Amara looked at the floor plan on her screen, at the room around her, which was going to be something different soon, at the window, which showed her the dark backyard and the faint outline of the garden she'd planted 3 years ago. "Sienna," she said. "Yes." "Are you still seeing him?" A pause. "No. That ended before the settlement. It ended." "Okay." Amara exhaled. "I'm not going to tell you it's all right. It's not something I can tell you, but I appreciate that you called." She paused. "Don't call again. Not because I hate you, just because there's nowhere for this to go." "I understand," Sienna said. Her voice was quiet. "Thank you for picking up." The line went dead. Amara sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment. She looked at the room. Her room. In her house. The one that was going to become something she could not yet fully picture, but was starting to see the shape of. She thought about what it cost a person to make a call like that. The particular kind of courage it required, or maybe the guilt that drives you past the fear of what courage costs. She didn't think Sienna was a bad person. She thought Sienna was a person who had made a bad choice, partly on the basis of information that turned out to be false, and who was now carrying the weight of that. She wasn't angry. She noticed that without judgment. It wasn't that she was trying not to be angry, it was that the anger had moved through her some time ago and left something quieter behind. She set the phone down. She picked up her cold tea. She looked back at the floor plan. She had work to do, and the night was long, and the house was very still around her in a way that was beginning, slowly, to feel less like emptiness and more like space. She pulled the laptop closer and went back to work. Raymond Okafor showed up on the first Monday of February with a clipboard, a laser measure, and the particular no-nonsense energy of a contractor who had been doing this long enough to know that clients who seemed calm were usually the most exacting. He was in his mid-50s, built like someone who still did physical work rather than just supervised it, and he had worked with Amara on 3 projects over the past 4 years. He was good. He was honest about timelines in a way that occasionally disappointed clients who wanted faster answers. Amara had always appreciated that about him more than the clients did. She walked him through the ground floor first, showing him the walls she wanted opened, the flow she was trying to create between what had been the living room, dining area, and study. She had the floor plan printed out and marked up in 3 colors: blue for structural questions, red for electrical, green for cosmetic work she could manage herself or with a lighter crew. Raymond stood in the center of the living room and looked up at the ceiling. He walked the perimeter slowly, knocking on walls in a few places, crouching to look at where the floor met the baseboard near the dining room archway. "Load-bearing?" Amara asked, pointing at the wall between the living room and the study. "Almost certainly not, but I want to pull the plans before I tell you that for certain. He made a note on his clipboard. How long has this house been in the family? 12 years since we bought it. Built in 1987. Any renovation work to the original structure? Kitchen, both bathrooms, the sunroom addition, all done in the first 3 years. I have the permits. He nodded. She had expected him to nod. That was what happened when you kept your permits. What's the timeline you're working toward? I want the ground floor done by late spring. The space above the garage is a secondary phase. I haven't fully decided on that scope yet, but I want your read on what it would take to make it a proper room. He wrote something else on his clipboard. And this is going to be a studio? You're moving the business here full time? Expanding it here. We're keeping the office downtown for client meetings that work better off-site. But the primary working space, the design library, the mentorship program I'm building, that'll be here. Raymond looked up from his clipboard. He had worked with her long enough to have a sense of her professional precision, and she could see him registering the scale of what she was describing. Mentorship program. 6 to 8 young designers a year, paid positions, structured learning alongside real project work. She said it plainly, the way she'd been saying it in her head for the past 3 weeks, trying on the language until it didn't sound like something she was reaching for, but something she was simply stating. He looked at her for a moment, not with doubt, with the particular kind of attention people paid when they were adjusting their understanding of the size of something. That's a real thing you're building. That's the plan. He went back to the clipboard. Okay, let me get the structural plans pulled and I'll have a preliminary estimate to you by end of week. She walked him upstairs and then up the pull-down attic stair to the space above the garage, and he stood in the low-ceilinged room, currently full of boxes and a broken lamp and 3 chairs that had been up here since the first year they'd moved in, and looked at the roofline and the floor joists and the single small window at the far end. You'd want dormers, he said, almost to himself. 2, if the structure supports it. He crouched and pressed on the floor with both hands, testing. Who put these joists in? Original construction. He made a sound that was not quite a word. Then, it's doable. It'll cost you, but it's doable. I know. He stood up. He looked at her across the low room with its dusty surfaces and its stacked boxes and its small, inadequate window. You've got a vision for this place. I've had a lot of time to think, she said. He nodded slowly. I'll have the estimate by Friday. The estimate came in higher than she'd hoped and lower than she'd feared, which was usually the most honest outcome with construction work. She spent a weekend with her laptop and her business accounts and her investment settlement figures, running the numbers with the kind of careful, methodical attention she gave to project budgets. She was not reckless with money. She had never been reckless with money. This was, she thought sometimes, part of what had been invisible about her to Brandon. He saw the beautiful home. He saw the well-run life. He did not see the hours she spent making sure the numbers underneath all of it were sound. She called Dina on Sunday evening. I'm going to do the full scope, she said. Ground floor and the room above the garage. I want it done properly or not at all. Dina was quiet for a moment. Do you have the capital? Between the settlement and what I've been setting aside in the business the past 3 years, yes. It'll be tight for about 6 months, but yes. You're sure? I'm sure. Another pause. Then I'm in, Dina said. All the way in. This is the right thing, Amara. It should have happened years ago. She said it simply, without hedging, and Amara felt the truth of it land. It should have happened years ago. She had thought about expanding the business before, had looked at larger studio spaces downtown twice in the past 5 years, had pulled back each time for reasons that felt practical at the time and felt, in retrospect, more like accommodation. Accommodation to a marriage where her professional life was supposed to stay a certain size, so it didn't outgrow the shape she'd been assigned within their shared story. She had not named it that way while she was living it. She was naming it now. One condition, Dina said. What? You let me handle the mentorship program structure, the curriculum, the application process, the evaluation framework. You focus on the physical space and the client work. That's a better division than both of us trying to do everything. Amara thought about this. Her instinct was to want her hands on every part of it. She was not naturally a person who delegated the things that mattered to her. But Dina was right, and one of the things the past few months had taught her, more starkly than she would have wanted, was that doing everything herself had costs she hadn't always been willing to count. Deal, she said. She did not think much about Brandon in February. This surprised her a little, or not the absence of thinking, which she'd learned to accept as the mind's protective instinct, but the absence of wanting to think about him. There had been stages earlier in this process when she had found herself circling back to him involuntarily, replaying conversations, recalculating things she'd said and things she'd missed, running the marriage through her head looking for the exact point where the foundation had cracked. She had recognized this as grief doing its work and had tried not to fight it too hard. But by February, it had quieted. Not gone. She didn't think it would be fully gone for a long time, maybe ever, in the way that anything you've carried for 15 years doesn't simply stop having weight, but quieter. Present the way a healed scar is present. You know it's there, it's part of the record, but it doesn't catch on everything the way a fresh one does. The renovation started in earnest the second week of February. The house was loud and dusty and constantly in motion. Raymond's crew was in by 7:30 most mornings. She had made this one of the conditions of the contract because she was a person who woke at 5:45 anyway and had no patience for contractors who materialized at 9. They were good workers, efficient and direct, and she spent more time on site than she probably needed to, but she had always been that way with projects, and she wasn't going to change it now that the project was her own home. She moved herself into the sunroom during the major demolition phase, setting up a temporary workspace among the construction chaos with her laptop and her files and an extension cord running to the nearest outlet. She took client calls with the sound of hammers in the background and apologized once, exactly once, and then stopped apologizing because her clients knew what she was doing and most of them found it interesting rather than off-putting. She was happier than she'd been in a long time. She noticed this with the particular awareness of someone who hadn't expected to feel that way for a while. The wall between the living room and the study came down on a Thursday morning. She was there when Raymond's crew swung the first sledgehammer, and she felt the impact of it somewhere in her chest. Not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, the physical finality of changing a space that had existed a certain way for a long time. She had stood in that room 2 years ago and decorated it for a Christmas party. She had stood in it 6 months ago and found her husband with another woman. She had stood in it alone at midnight running measurements while he slept down the hall. And now it was open to the room beside it, and cold February air moved through the new gap in the wall, and Raymond was already measuring the header beam, and the room was going to be something she'd designed from the beginning. She took a photograph of the gap in the wall. She sent it to her mother without a caption. Her mother texted back, "Good." It was Dina who told her about the board review. She hadn't been following Brandon's professional situation. She had made a deliberate choice not to, partly because it wasn't her business anymore, and partly because tracking his difficulties would have required her to keep a part of her attention anchored to him, and she was trying to move that attention elsewhere. But Dina had a friend who worked in commercial real estate circles, and news traveled. The board put his division under formal review, Dina said. They were sitting at Amara's temporary work table in the sunroom, looking at material samples for the studio floor, a week into the renovation. From what Rachel heard, it's not about the divorce directly. It's about some deals he closed last year that are underperforming, but the timing of everything made it harder for him to manage the optics. Amara looked at a sample of white oak flooring. She set it down and picked up a darker one. Is he going to lose his position? Unclear. Rachel thinks he might move to a different division, voluntarily, to avoid the formal outcome. A pause. It's not good for him. Amara was quiet for a moment, turning this floor sample in her hands. She thought about Brandon across the conference table, reading documents he wished he'd read 15 years earlier. She thought about him at the kitchen island at 7 in the morning, looking like a man who hadn't slept and didn't know how to talk about it. I don't want him destroyed, she said. I've never wanted that. I know. But I'm also not going to pretend the consequences aren't related to choices he made. No, Dina agreed. They are. Amara set down the floor sample. She picked up the white oak again. I'm going with this one, she said. It'll read warmer in the space. The lighter one, Dina said, nodding. Yes, I was going to say that. They moved on to the next sample. Us. Brandon called her in March. She saw his name on her phone and stood in the middle of the half-demolished ground floor, plaster dust on her sleeve, and let it ring twice before she answered. This was not because she was being strategic. She was genuinely caught off guard, and she needed the 2 rings to shift gears. Brandon, she said. Hey. His voice had a texture she hadn't heard in it before, so something worn down, some of the polish abraded off it. I'm sorry to call out of nowhere. I tried to think about whether there was a better way to do this, and I couldn't figure out what it was. It's okay. What is it? A pause. I'm moving. Out of the city. I've taken a position in Charlotte. A lateral move, different firm, new start. I leave at the end of the month. She absorbed this. Charlotte was 4 hours away. Not across the world, not even across the state line, but far enough that it represented a genuine departure rather than a change of address. Okay, she said. I wanted to tell you directly, not have you hear it from someone else. Another pause. And I wanted to say something. She waited. What you built here. He stopped. She could hear him trying to find the right shape for what he was trying to say and not quite finding it. I drove past the house last week. I know I shouldn't have. I wasn't going to stop. I drove past, and I could see the work being done, the scaffolding on the garage. She looked up at the ceiling of the half-finished room she was standing in, at the place where a wall had been. I can see what you're doing with it, he said. I don't know exactly, but I can see it's something bigger than what it was. A pause. It should have always been yours. I understand that now. Not just legally. It was always more yours than mine. I just lived in it. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about 15 years, and the garden, and the stones she'd laid with her aching back, and the Christmas presents, and the 47 corporate dinners, and the prenuptial agreement he hadn't read. I hope Charlotte is a good start for you, she said. And she meant it, not as a performance of generosity, but as a plain statement of what she actually felt, which was that she did not wish him harm. She had never wished him harm. Harm and accountability were different things, and she had learned to keep that distinction clear. Thank you, he said, quietly. Amara, care of yourself. I will. She hung up. She stood in the room for a minute longer, then she put her phone in her pocket and went back to looking at the wall Raymond's crew had started framing out on the other side of the space. She had measurements to check and a floor plan to finalize and a contractor waiting on her decision about the window placement, and the day was moving and there was work to do. The hardest month was March, and it had nothing to do with Brandon. It had to do with a Thursday evening call from her mother, who said in the measured, careful voice she used when she did not want to alarm unnecessarily that she had been having some symptoms her doctor wanted to investigate further, chest pressure, some fatigue. She had an appointment the following week for more tests. What kind of tests? Amara said. She was sitting in the car in front of the house, not yet ready to go inside, the engine still running. A stress test and some imaging. Standard things, from what Dr. Reeves said. When were you going to tell me? A pause. I'm telling you now. Mom. Amara, I didn't want to worry you until there was something specific to worry about. She gripped the steering wheel. This is specific. It might be nothing. And it might not be. Her mother was quiet. I'm coming Sunday, Amara said. I'm coming Sunday, and I'll take you to the appointment Thursday. You don't need to... Mom. Her voice came out harder than she intended. She softened it. Please, just let me come. A long pause. Okay, her mother said finally. Come Sunday. She sat in the car for a long time after she hung up. The engine idled. The evening was dark and cold, and the house in front of her was full of sawdust and scaffolding and the ongoing construction of something new, and she thought about the way life layered things on top of each other without any regard for timing. New starts and old fears landing in the same breath, joy and worry sharing the same week without apology. She had spent months building toward solid ground, and now she was sitting in her car, afraid in a completely different way than she'd been afraid before. This fear was older and ran deeper, the kind that had nothing to do with marriage or money or legal documents and everything to do with the simple fact that her mother was 71 and had chest pressure and a doctor who wanted more tests. And Celestine Ellington was the person in the world Amara was least prepared to be without. She turned off the engine. She went inside. She made herself dinner and called Dina and talked about the renovation for 20 minutes without mentioning the phone call, and then after she hung up, she sat at her temporary work table in the sunroom and stared at the floor plan without seeing it. She let herself be afraid for a while, not fighting it, not redirecting it, just sitting with it the way you sit with weather you can't do anything about. Then she got up and made a cup of tea and came back to the table and started working. The appointment. Thursday was at 2 in the afternoon at a cardiology practice 40 minutes from her mother's house. Amara drove. Her mother sat in the passenger seat in a good coat and good shoes, because Celestine Ellington had always believed in being presentable for medical appointments on the grounds that it was a form of respect. They did not talk about the tests on the way there. They talked about the renovation. Amara had photographs on her phone, and her mother looked at each one with careful attention, asking specific questions about the ceiling height and the flooring choice, and how the light would move through the new open space in the morning versus the afternoon. Her mother had the eye. It had always been there, that attention to how a space worked, and Amara had understood for most of her adult life that the things she did professionally was something she had inherited. The test took 2 hours. Amara sat in a waiting room with a bad magazine and an adequate cup of coffee, and the specific quality of helplessness that came from being a person who solved problems for a living and being placed in a situation where there was nothing to solve, only to wait. Her mother came out looking composed and tired. They got in the car. "Well," Amara said, "Dr. Reeves will call with results next week." Her mother adjusted her seatbelt. She didn't seem alarmed. I'm choosing to take that as meaningful. Was she alarmed when she first recommended the tests? She was thorough. There's a difference. Amara started the car. She pulled out of the parking lot. "Are you scared?" Her mother looked out the window. "A little," she said, which was, from Celestine Ellington, equivalent to another person saying a great deal. "But I've had a good life. I'm not finished with it, but if something is wrong and it's manageable, we'll manage it. And if it's not manageable..." She stopped. "I didn't raise you to fall apart, and I don't intend to model that now." Amara's jaw tightened. She kept her eyes on the road. "Can you not plan ahead that far tonight?" A small pause. "Yes," her mother said. "I can do that." They drove. After a while, her mother said, "Tell me more about the mentorship program, the structure of it." So Amara talked. She talked about what Dina was building and what she was building and the shape it was taking, the 6 to 8 young designers a year, the structured curriculum alongside real project work, the way the house would hold all of it. She talked about the light in the new open space and what it would feel like to work in it, and about the room above the garage with its 2 planned dormers, and how she wanted to line one wall entirely with shelves for the material library she'd been building for 15 years. Her mother listened without interrupting, the way she'd always listened. When Amara finished, her mother said, "Your father would have loved to see this." She didn't say anything back for a moment. The road curved through the dark and the headlights caught the tree line on either side. "I know," she said. The results came the following Tuesday. Celestine called Amara herself at 10 in the morning, which meant she had already spoken to Dr. Reeves and processed the information enough to report it. "Mild arrhythmia," she said. "Manageable with medication. Dr. Reeves says it's very common and very treatable, and that I should have come in a year ago when the fatigue started, rather than deciding it was just age." Amara was at her desk. She had been in the middle of a client email. She closed the laptop. "Manageable." That's the word she used, several times, I think, to be clear about it. "Medication. Starting Thursday." She explained everything. I wrote it all down. A pause. "I'm fine, Amara." She put her hand over her eyes. She was not going to cry in the middle of her temporary work table in the sunroom with plaster dust on every surface. She was not. "Okay," she said. Her voice came out a little unsteady. "Okay," her mother echoed more gently. "It's okay." They stayed on the phone for a while without talking much. That was one of the things she had always loved about her mother. The ability to share silence without it feeling like something that needed to be filled. Eventually, her mother said, "Go back to work." "I'm going." "And call me Sunday." "I always call Sunday." "I know. I like saying it anyway." The ground floor was finished in the last week of March. Raymond's crew cleared out on a Friday afternoon, and Amara walked through the space alone in the early evening with the renovation smell still heavy in the air, fresh paint, new wood, the slight chemical edge of the floor sealant that had been laid 2 days ago. The living room and the dining area and the study were one space now. Flowing, open, anchored at one end by the original fireplace she had insisted on keeping, and at the other by the new floor-to-ceiling shelving unit Raymond's crew had built along the former study wall. The white oak floors ran throughout in warm, continuous lines. The light came through the windows differently now, more of it, reaching further into the room because there was no longer a wall breaking it apart. She stood in the center of the space and turned slowly. It looked like somewhere she would have designed for someone else. Someone she admired, whose work she respected, whose life she thought was being well used. She had designed it for herself. That was a thing she was still getting used to, the permission of it. The straightforward act of making something exactly the way you wanted it, without negotiating it against someone else's preferences or comfort or quiet resistance. She had been so accustomed to that negotiation that its absence felt almost disorienting, like a sound you've been straining to hear over finally going quiet, and you realize how much energy you were spending on the strain. She took photographs. She sent them to her mother and to Dina and to Raymond, who texted back a single word, beautiful. She made herself dinner in the kitchen and ate it at the island and looked through the new open archway at the studio space, at the evening light moving across the white oak floor. She thought about the proposal she'd written in January, the document that had started as notes on her phone and become a real plan. 6 to 8 young designers a year, paid positions, structured learning, a material library on the second floor of the garage, a business that was not just hers and Dina's, but that was actively making space for people who were at the beginning of what she had spent 20 years building. She thought about the version of herself who had stood in this room 4 months ago, with her hands shaking after telling Brandon to call Malcolm. How much had been uncertain then? How many things she hadn't known yet? She still didn't know all of it. The program wasn't launched. The room above the garage was still scaffolding. Her mother was managing a heart condition and taking new medication, and Amara called her every Sunday and every Thursday, and sometimes in between just to hear her voice. Life was not resolved. It was just continuing, which was a different thing, and she was learning to tell the difference. She rinsed her plate. She went to the studio space and sat down at the work table she'd moved in that morning. Her real desk, the one from her downtown office, the large one she'd had for 9 years with the drawer that stuck unless you lifted the handle slightly. She opened her laptop. She had 3 client proposals to review and a meeting with Dina tomorrow morning and a call with a potential mentorship program applicant on Friday. The first one. The first person to respond to the quiet, informal announcement she'd made through her professional network 2 weeks ago. She had work to do. The house was quiet and full of new light and smelled like fresh paint and the beginning of something, and she pulled the first client file up on her screen and got to work. The first mentorship application came in on a Friday morning in early April, 3 days after Amara had sent a quiet announcement through her professional network. Not a press release, not a formal advertisement, just a message she'd drafted and redrafted 6 times before sending because she kept making it sound either too grand or too modest, and neither felt right. She had finally sent the version that was just honest. A new program, a working studio in a renovated residential space. 6 positions for the coming year, paid, structured around real project work. Applications open to designers within 5 years of their formal training. Contact her directly. The first response was from a young woman named Precious Adeyemi, 26 years old, recently graduated from a design program in Atlanta, currently working as a junior assistant at a commercial firm where she was, by her own description in the email, doing mostly administrative work and losing patience with waiting for someone to let her do the things she'd trained to do. Amara read the email twice. There was something in the directness of it, the lack of excessive formality, the clear frustration underneath the professional language. That made her pay attention. She had been that person. Not at 26, she had been more cautious at 26, but she understood the feeling. The particular impatience of competence in a situation that won't let you use it. She wrote back the same day. Over the following 2 weeks, 7 more responses came in. Some were polished and careful, with portfolios attached and cover letters that had clearly been revised until every edge was smooth. A few were rougher, less practiced at presenting themselves, but with work samples that showed a genuine instinct that couldn't be performed. One came from a 31-year-old man named Theo Gaines, who had left a career in architecture after 5 years to pursue residential interior work, and whose portfolio had a quality that Amara recognized immediately as the kind of thing that developed when someone had technical training plus an actual point of view rather than just technical training. She called Dina on a Sunday evening with the 8 applications spread across her work table in the studio. "Walk me through them," Dina said. She had been building the evaluation framework for weeks, a structured rubric that considered portfolio quality, written communication, professional history, and a 4th category she'd labeled simply specificity, the degree to which an applicant could articulate not just what they wanted to do, but why and how they thought about it. They spent an hour on the phone going through each one, arguing about 2 of them, agreeing quickly on 3, setting 2 aside for a second look. "Precious Adeyemi," Dina said when they got to her, "you've already decided." I haven't decided anything. Amara. A pause. She's direct. She knows what she wants. She's frustrated in her current position for the right reasons. She's also 26, and she might be a difficult personality in a structured program. So was I at 26, Dina laughed. I know, that's why I'm saying it. Amara looked at the printed email, at Precious's portfolio printout spread alongside it. She's in, she said. And before you argue, I'm the one who built this program. I get one instinct call. Fine, Dina said, but I want to interview her before it's final. Obviously. They landed on 6 names by the end of the call. Precious Adeyemi, Theo Gaines, 4 others, a woman from Savannah who specialized in color, a recent graduate from a state school whose portfolio was technically rough, but showed an extraordinary attention to material, and 2 others whose combinations of skill and approach balanced the group in ways that felt considered rather than arbitrary. Dina drafted the interview schedule. Amara sent the invitation emails Monday morning. The interviews happened over 2 weeks in April in the studio. She had set up the space for it, the work table cleared, a small seating area arranged near the windows where the light was good, the material library starting to take shape on the shelving unit along the back wall. Though the room above the garage was still 2 months from completion, she interviewed each person herself, with Dina present and taking notes. She had a list of questions, but she didn't follow it rigidly, because the best information usually came from where a conversation went when you stopped directing it. She asked them about the work they were proudest of and the work that had failed and what they thought failing had taught them. She asked them what they thought clients actually needed versus what they said they needed. She asked them what they would do differently about their training if they could go back. Precious Adeyemi came in on a Wednesday afternoon. She was tall, natural hair pulled back, wearing a jacket that was slightly too large for her in a way that looked intentional rather than accidental. She shook Amara's hand and Dina's hand and sat down without fidgeting. Tell me about the last project you worked on at your current firm, Amara said. I organized files and sourced fabric samples for a project I wasn't allowed to attend the client meeting for. Precious said it without self-pity, just fact. The lead designer presented the samples I sourced, and the client chose 2 of them. I know because I saw the selection sheet on the printer. How did that make you feel? Honestly, it made me understand that I needed to be somewhere else. She looked at Amara directly. That's not a complaint, that's just true. Amara nodded. What do you want to learn this year that you can't learn where you are? Without hesitating, how decisions get made. I can see the output of design decisions, but I'm never in the room when they're made. I want to understand the reasoning, not just the result. Dina made a note. After Precious left, Dina looked up from her notes. She's in, she said. I told you. You were right. Dina put her pen down. Amara, this is going to be something real. She looked around the studio, at the floor she'd chosen, and the light through the windows, and the material library taking shape, and the empty space that would soon have 6 people working in it, learning in it, arguing about design decisions in it, the way she had always wanted to argue about design decisions with people who cared. I know, she said, and for the first time in a long time, saying it didn't feel like convincing herself of anything. Well, the room above the garage was finished in the 3rd week of May. Raymond's crew installed the last of the dormer windows on a Tuesday morning, and the light that came through them changed the room completely. 2 rectangles of clean skylight falling across the new wood floor, reaching all the way to the opposite wall. The shelving along the back wall was done, floor to ceiling, the material library installed in sections by category. Fabric samples in labeled flat files. Finished samples on pull-out trays. A dedicated section for flooring materials, one for hardware, one for what Amara called reference objects. Pieces she had collected over years that weren't attached to any specific project, but that she kept because they said something true about proportion, or texture, or the way a material aged. She had spent 3 evenings installing the library herself, which Raymond had told her was unnecessary, and she had done anyway because some things needed to be done by your own hands, or they didn't feel properly yours. When it was finished, she stood in the doorway and looked at it. She thought about the first time she'd come up here after Brandon left. The pull-down attic stair, the boxes, the broken lamp, the single insufficient window. The way the space had felt like wasted potential, like something that had been ignored for so long it had forgotten what it was for. The dormers were Raymond's idea. She had taken it without hesitation because it was the right idea regardless of where it came from, and she had learned over 20 years that the most important skill in design wasn't generating ideas but recognizing them. She pulled out her phone and called her mother. "The library is done," she said. "Send me pictures." She took pictures and sent them while they talked. Her mother responded to each one with specific observations, not just beautiful or lovely, but actual notes. "The light from the left dormer will be best in the morning. Are the flat files deep enough for larger fabric samples? That reference shelf will need more space within a year." Celestine Ellington had been a paralegal, but she had always had the eye, and the eye didn't care what profession it attached to. "How are you feeling?" Amara asked. Her mother had been on the arrhythmia medication for 6 weeks. There had been an adjustment period, some fatigue, some dizziness in the first 2 weeks that had frightened Amara more than her mother was willing to admit it had frightened her. And then a settling, and Dr. Reeves' most recent appointment had been, by her mother's description, boringly uneventful. "Good," her mother said. "Genuinely good. I walked 1.5 miles this morning." 1.5 miles? "I'm not an invalid, Amara." "I know, I just... 1.5 miles. The doctor said walking was good. I walked." A pause, and she could hear the smile in it. "Don't make a thing of it." "I'm not making a thing." "You're making a thing." She laughed. A real one, unguarded. "Fine, 1.5 miles. That's good, Mom." "Yes," her mother said. "It is." The program launched officially the first week of June. 6 people came into the studio on a Monday morning, and Amara had made coffee, which she put on the work table along with a box of pastries from a bakery 3 blocks away that she had discovered during the renovation when she'd started taking morning walks as a way of clearing her head. She had not made a speech. She had not prepared remarks. She had thought about it and decided that the thing she most wanted to avoid was the quality of formality that made a beginning feel like an occasion rather than a start. She just told them how it was going to work. They would be assigned to real client projects with graduated responsibility, starting as support and moving toward independent decision-making as the year progressed. They would meet as a group twice a week to discuss ongoing work, not in a classroom format, but as a working conversation. They would each, by the end of the year, have led at least one complete project from client intake to installation. She and Dina would be present and available and critical and honest, and she told them this last part directly because she thought they deserved to know it going in. "I'm not going to tell you your work is wonderful when it isn't," she said. "I've been told my work was wonderful when it wasn't, and it didn't help me. What helped me was someone I respected telling me specifically what was wrong and specifically what to do differently." She looked around the table. "That's what I'm committing to. Not kindness as performance, actual investment." Precious was watching her with the kind of focused attention that some people gave when they were really listening and not composing their response. Theo Gaines had a notebook open and was writing something down. The woman from Savannah, her name was Lila, was looking at the material library through the open doorway to the back of the room with an expression that Amara recognized as the thing that happened when a space made sense to you. She felt something settle in her chest. Not resolution exactly. She had stopped expecting the clean version of that. But something like rightness, the sense of a thing being in its correct position. "Ask question," she said. "Start now." They started. The first month was imperfect in the ways first months always were. Precious turned out to be right about her own directness. She was direct to the point of occasional bluntness. And in the second week, she told a client during a site visit that their existing furniture was working against everything we're trying to do in the space, which was true and also not the right moment to say it, and Amara had a conversation with her about it afterward that was uncomfortable for both of them. "You weren't wrong," Amara told her. They were sitting at the work table after the others had gone for the day. "The furniture is wrong, but the client spent 30 years accumulating it, and some of those pieces have history. You can be right about the design and wrong about the delivery." Precious was quiet for a moment. "I said what I thought." "I know, and I'm not asking you to stop thinking it. I'm asking you to understand that how you say something changes what the person hears." A pause. "I have made the same mistake. More than once. It costs you the relationship, and relationships are half the work." "Is that something you figured out on your own, or did someone tell you?" Amara thought about it. "Both. Took me a while to believe it when someone told me." Precious looked at her with the direct attention that was already her particular quality. "Did something teach you to be careful about how you say things? Like something specific?" Amara thought about 15 years of choosing her words carefully in a marriage, of being measured and reasonable, and keeping her voice even in conversations that made her want to be anything but. She thought about what that had cost her and what it had protected, and how the skill itself was not the problem. The problem was what she'd been using it to protect. Yes, she said, but that's a longer conversation for another time. Precious nodded. She didn't push. Amara gave her a point in her head for that. Theo Gaines was the opposite kind of challenge, too careful, too deferential, consistently offering ideas in the form of questions rather than statements, as if waiting for permission to have a point of view. She pulled him aside in the third week and told him directly that his instincts were good and she needed him to stop framing them as requests. If you think the wall color is wrong, say the wall color is wrong, she told him. Don't say, do you think maybe the wall color might possibly be a consideration? You sound uncertain when you're not. He looked slightly startled. I didn't realize I was doing that. Most people don't realize, that's why I'm telling you. He was better after that. Not immediately. Habits didn't break in a day. But she could see him catching himself, choosing the direct version of things, building the muscle of speaking with authority about work. He understood. That was what the year was supposed to do. Not transform anyone, not produce finished designers from people who were already mostly formed. Just remove some of the obstacles, the habits of deference, the fear of directness, the gap between what someone knew and what they were willing to say out loud. Summer arrived and the house was fully itself. The studio ran on its own rhythm now. The 6 of them in and out through the week, client work moving through the space, the material library upstairs getting used in ways that made Amara feel the hours she'd spent organizing it were worth everyone. She and Dina had fallen into a working pattern that used their different strengths without either of them having to announce it. Dina handling the program structure and the administrative machinery of the business, Amara handling the client work and the mentoring, both of them talking everything through in their Tuesday morning meetings that ran long almost every week. The downtown office had been reduced to 1 day a week. The rest of the time, everything happened here. She had been thinking about what that meant, not just practically, but in terms of what her daily life actually looked like now versus what it had looked like a year ago. She drove to meetings. She walked to the bakery in the morning. She spent her days in a space she had built, doing work she had chosen, with people whose development she was genuinely invested in. She called her mother twice a week and visited once a month, and her mother walked 1.5 miles most mornings, and her heart medication was working, and Dr. Reeves had said the word stable at the last appointment as if it were the most ordinary thing, which it was, except that to Amara, it was every good thing. She was not happy the way she had been happy in the early years of her marriage. The clean, uncomplicated happiness of a life that seemed to be going according to plan. That kind of happiness, she had learned, was partly a product of not yet knowing what the plan was capable of not delivering. This happiness was different. It had weight to it. It had been paid for in ways that had been genuinely expensive, and that made it feel more like something she possessed than something that was happening to her. She was not going to pretend that the year hadn't cost her. She had loved Brandon, imperfectly, and perhaps with too much patience for too long, but genuinely. The end of the marriage had not been a relief in any clean sense. It had been a loss, the kind that restructured things rather than merely removing something. She was different than she'd been before it. Some of that different was better, and some of it was just different, and she was learning to let those two categories coexist without needing to collapse them into each other. Brandon called her once more in July. She was in the studio, late afternoon, the light coming in at the long angle. It reached in summer that turned the white oak floor a shade of amber she had loved since the first day. She was looking at tile samples for a client bathroom and making notes on the proportions when her phone lit up with his name, and she looked at it for a moment before answering. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He sounded different than the last call in March. Less worn, more settled, maybe, or just acclimatized to whatever Charlotte was. "I'm not calling about anything specific. I wanted to ask how you were." She set down the tile sample. "I'm good, Brandon. Actually good." "Yeah?" A pause. "I can hear it. How are you?" "Getting there." He said it like it was honest rather than diplomatic. "Different firm, different city. Starting over it's harder than I thought it would be, but I think it's the right thing." "I think so too." A short silence that wasn't particularly uncomfortable. "I heard the program launched," he said. She wondered briefly which mutual connection that had traveled through. The network of their former social world was smaller now, but not entirely dissolved. "It did," 6 people. We're 3 months in. How is it? It's good. It's a lot of work, and it's good. She paused. Precious Adeyemi is going to be remarkable. She told a client their furniture was wrong on the second week, and I had to have a conversation with her about delivery. He laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. You at 26. That's what Dina said. How's Dina? Good. Running everything I shouldn't be running myself. Another pause. I'm glad, he said. I mean that. I'm genuinely glad you built this. She believed him. She had thought about whether she would believe him when she heard him say something like this, and she found that she did, without effort or suspicion. Whatever Brandon was or wasn't, whatever he had done and failed to do, he had known her long enough to understand the size of what she was building and what it meant that she was building it. Thank you, she said. I should let you go. Yeah, take care of yourself, Brandon. You too. She set the phone down. She looked at the tile samples. She picked up the one she'd been looking at before the call, a matte white ceramic with a very slight texture, not quite flat, not quite glossy, the kind of material that read differently depending on the light and was interesting because of it. She put it in the yes pile and kept working. There was a moment in August that she would think about for a long time afterward. It was a Thursday evening, later than she usually stayed in the studio. The others had gone home. Dina had left at 6. The light had shifted to the long gold of late summer evening that came through the western windows and lay in warm rectangles across the floor. She was alone in the space with the day's work and the sounds of the house settling in the heat and the faint noise of the street outside. She was reviewing a project file for a client presentation the following morning, but she had stopped actually reading it several minutes ago and was just sitting in the space, in the light, in the quiet. She thought about something Theo had said that afternoon during their group session. They had been discussing a project he was managing, a young couple's first home, modest budget, the kind of project that required careful prioritization. And he had said something about the difference between what a client said they wanted and what the space was actually asking for. Sometimes the room already knows what it needs, he had said. You just have to listen to it long enough. She had told him that was a good instinct. She hadn't told him it was also something she believed about everything, not just rooms. She had spent a long time not listening to what her own life was asking for. This was not entirely her fault. She had been building something real alongside Brandon, something that genuinely had value and mattered, and it was not simple or clean to say that the wrong thing was happening when so many parts of it were right. Life wasn't that tidy. You could be in the wrong situation and also be doing good work, and also love the person you were with, and also be losing yourself gradually in ways you didn't have a name for until you did. She had a name for it now. She had called it accommodation, adjustment, the reasonable management of a shared life. And it had been those things, but it had also been, slowly and over a long period of time, the practice of making herself smaller so that the life she was in could stay the same size. The house was not small now. She looked at the studio around her. The material library upstairs, the open flow of the ground floor, the work table where 6 people had sat that morning arguing about grout color with the seriousness the argument deserved. She looked at the light on the floor. She thought about Precious Adeyemi, who was direct to the point of occasionally needing management, and Theo Gaines, who was learning to say what he meant, and Lila from Savannah, who had cried quietly the first time a client had selected her palette recommendation, and then, when Amara mentioned it, had said she hadn't cried, which was such a transparent thing that it had made everyone laugh. She thought about her mother walking 1.5 miles in the mornings, about the arrhythmia medication that was working, about the fact that 71 was not young, but was also not what it used to be, and that her mother had at minimum another decade of telling her to stop making things, and Amara intended to receive every year of it. She thought about the brass key she had taken from her desk drawer the day she walked out of this house for the first time, the one that was now back in the locked drawer because the house was hers, and there was nothing to guard against. She had looked at that key a few times over the past months, trying to understand why she'd taken it. She thought she understood now. She had taken it because on some level, even in the worst moment, she had known that leaving was not the same as being gone. She had taken the key because she intended to come back. Not to the marriage, not to the life as it had been, but to herself in the space she had built. She had always been coming back. Dina suggested they have a small gathering at the end of the program's first quarter. Not a party exactly, just a marking of the time, an acknowledgement that 3 months had passed and something was being built. Amara agreed on the condition that she got to cook, which Dina said was surprising because she hadn't known Amara cooked, And Amara said she did when she had time to, and she hadn't had time in years, and she wanted to now. She spent a Saturday making food. It was not a performance of domesticity, and it was not a performance of anything. She just wanted to cook, wanted to stand at the stove of the kitchen she had renovated 12 years ago and smell garlic, and hear oil, and feel the simple physical satisfaction of making something you could eat. She had forgotten how much she liked it. Probably it had been easier to forget when the kitchen was a shared space, when cooking had been tangled up in obligation and the maintenance of a life that was running, at its core, on an imbalance she hadn't fully named. She made too much food, which was fine. They were 6 people plus her and Dina, and she had made enough for 12 and she didn't care. The gathering was on a Sunday evening. They filled the studio, which had never held that many people before, and the noise of it, the conversations running over each other, the laughter, the sound of 6 people who had spent 3 months working together and arguing about design decisions and figuring out how to be honest in a professional context, was something she had not prepared herself for. Not in a bad way. In the way of something you'd been working toward that turns out to be real when you reach it. She stood at the edge of the room with a glass of wine, watching Precious explain something to Theo with the focused intensity she brought to everything, and watching Lila show something on her phone to 2 of the others, and watching the light in the room, which was different at this hour than at any other hour, and she felt the thing that was the specific feeling of having built something that existed independently of you, that would be here tomorrow, when you weren't, that had weight and substance and its own momentum. Dina appeared at her shoulder. "How are you feeling?" Dina said. "Like I should have done this 10 years ago," Amara said. "You couldn't have done this 10 years ago." "I know." She watched Theo laugh at something Precious said. "But I feel it anyway." "That's allowed," Dina said. "You're allowed to feel the timeline you didn't get and still be glad about the one you have." She looked at her business partner of 6 years, this woman who had been steady and smart and present through the worst of the past year, without turning any of it into something she needed credit for. She thought about what it meant to have chosen well in a business partnership, how different it was from what she had experienced in the marriage, not because Brandon had been entirely wrong for her, but because the foundation of it had been different. She and Dina had built something on the basis of what each of them actually contributed rather than the story they were telling together. "Thank you," Amara said. Dina looked at her. "For what specifically?" "For all of it. For being in." "I was always going to be in," Dina said simply. "This was always going to be the thing we built." She raised her glass slightly. "We just needed the space." They stood together for a moment in the room that was full of noise and people and the work of a year that had begun in the worst possible circumstances and ended up here, and Amara let herself be fully present in it rather than halfway out of it, looking at what came next. October came with this particular quality of light that she had always loved about that month. Lower, more angled, a warmth in it that felt borrowed rather than given, like the sun was making its best case before the cold settled in. The program was 8 months old. The first cohort had grown into themselves in the ways she'd hoped and the ways she hadn't predicted, and a few ways that had genuinely surprised her. Precious had managed her last 2 client interactions with a care that was more sophisticated than the bluntness of April, without losing any of the directness that made her good. Theo had given a client presentation 3 weeks ago that Amara had sat in the back for and watched with the particular pride of a person who has watched someone become more fully themselves. She had submitted the program officially, filed the structure with her business registration, created a name for it, set up the infrastructure for applications for the following year's cohort. The name was simple. She had not wanted it to be elaborate. She had called it the Ellington Design Fellowship, which used her name not out of vanity, but because she wanted it connected to her by name, wanted there to be accountability in it, wanted the young designers who applied to know that this was something a specific person had built and was standing behind. Her mother had approved of the name. This mattered more than most opinions. She was sitting in the material library on a Wednesday afternoon in October, pulling references for a project that was complicated in the good way. A client who had specific taste and trusted her enough to explain it honestly, which was the best kind of client, when she heard someone come up the stairs and stop in the doorway. It was Precious. "Sorry," Precious said. "I didn't know you were up here." "It's fine. What do you need?" "I had a question about the Hargrove project. The client sent an email about the kitchen tile, and I'm not sure how to respond." "Pull up a chair." Precious sat down across from her at the small table in the library. She pulled out her phone and showed Amara the email. The client was having second thoughts about a tile selection she'd confirmed 3 weeks earlier, not because she disliked it, but because a friend had commented on it. "What do you want to say to her?" Amara asked. "That the tile is correct, and her friend doesn't know what she's talking about." "And what are you going to say to her?" Precious made a face. "I'm going to acknowledge her concern and remind her what her original reasons were for choosing it." "Exactly right." Amara handed the phone back. "And then?" "And then I'm going to ask if she wants to see the tile again in the actual space before we finalize." "That's good. That's exactly right." She looked at Precious. "Where did that instinct come from?" Precious thought about it. "From the conversation we had in April, about the furniture." "Right." Amara paused. "You remembered that." "I remember everything you tell me," said without flattery, just as fact. "I'm paying attention." Amara looked at the young woman across the table from her, 26 years old, too direct for her own comfort sometimes, working at something she believed in, paying attention. She thought about what it had cost to create this room, this program, this space. She thought about the 15 years of a marriage that had been real, even when it was wrong. She thought about this document Brandon had signed without reading, and her mother's voice on the phone, and the brass key in the locked drawer, and the wall that came down on a Thursday morning in February, and the light that moved through the dormers at 8 o'clock in the morning and fell across the material library floor in 2 clean rectangles. She thought about the person she had been before any of it happened. The woman who got up at 5:45 and made coffee in a kitchen she had renovated and believed on some level that the life she was maintaining was the life she was living. She was glad she was not that woman anymore. She did not say this without tenderness for her, but she understood why that woman had been who she was, and she did not blame her for it. But she was glad to be here instead. In this room, in this house, with its history fully known and its future fully hers. "Go write the email," she told Precious. Precious stood up. "Okay." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "Can I ask you something that's not about work?" Amara raised an eyebrow. "Did you always know you were going to do something like this? The program?" She thought about the honest answer. "No," she said. "I knew I wanted to. But I thought it was the kind of thing you wanted and didn't do because there wasn't space for it." "What made space?" A pause. The light in the library was that particular October quality. Borrowed warmth, limited time, everything it touched made more specific by it. She thought about how to answer this in a way that was true without being more than Precious needed. "I stopped taking up less room than I needed," she said. "Eventually." Precious looked at her for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if she was putting something away carefully for later. "Okay," she said. She left. Amara heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard the sound of the studio below resuming its ordinary noise. She turned back to her reference materials. She had work to do. She always had work to do, and she was grateful for it in a way she hadn't always been, grateful for the specific texture of days that were full of things she had chosen. She pulled the tile sample she was looking for from the flat file and set it on the table in the October light, and looked at it the way she looked at everything now, with the full weight of her attention. There was a bathroom to design. There were 6 young designers downstairs building toward something they couldn't quite see yet. There was her mother walking a mile and a half in the mornings and calling on Sundays. There was Dana, who was already setting up the application system for next year's cohort. There was the house, which was not a symbol of a marriage anymore, and was not a wound and was not a legal victory. It was just a place where work happened and light moved through particular windows at particular hours, and the floors were white oak and held warm in a way that she had known they would when she chose them. It was hers. It had always been hers. Not because of a document, though the document had mattered. Not because of a clause in a prenuptial agreement, though the clause had mattered. It was hers because she had built it, with her hands and her eye and her years, and because building it had always been the truest thing about who she was. The rest? The marriage, the betrayal, the legal proceedings, the weeks of living in the same house as a man who was becoming a stranger, the phone call from a woman on a January night, all of it had been real. She was not going to pretend otherwise. It had happened, and it had cost her, and she was changed by it in ways she was still discovering. But it had not defined her. She had defined herself, the way she always had, through the work. Through the long, patient hours of paying attention and making decisions and building things that lasted. That was who she was. That was who she had always been. And the house knew it, in the way that rooms eventually know the people who love them best, holding the light for her at the right hours, settling quietly when she worked late, keeping the record of everything she had made within its walls. She pulled her notebook toward her. She uncapped her pen. Outside, the October light was moving, the way light always moved, indifferent and generous in equal measure. She started to